Morning, everybody. First of all, thank you very much for waking up this early and for suffering through the traffic jam. So there's lots and lots of talk about scaling Agile. Last couple of years, you know, every time somebody sneezes, there's another kind of way of scaling Agile, whether that's kind of, you know, some new way of dealing with Scrum or some kind of new way of making Agile for enterprises. Everybody's talking about that, and that scares me a lot. Because most of the time when people talk about scaling Agile, they talk about how do we spend more money faster. I'll give you an example. I was invited to a big bank where they were going to kind of transform, whatever that means, to Agile. And there were several different consultancies trying to kind of compete for that job, and the managing director of that part of the bank said, well, you know, how would you move us to Agile? And I asked a stupid question. I said, well, you know, how would you know that you moved to Agile? I mean, you know, what would you measure? What's the result you want? And that ended up being horribly bad because I put a managing director of a big department of a bank in a spot where he didn't know how to answer the question. So kind of a week later, we met again, and they said, okay, now we have an objective for what it means to be Agile. I said, okay, that's good, tell me. He said, well, last year we have done 35 million pounds of change through this department. Next year, if we're Agile, we're going to be able to do 70 million pounds of change. And I said, that sounds nice. It's a double the number, but what does change mean? I mean, how do you measure it? And then I ended up in a stupid situation because I put a managing director of a big department of a bank in a situation where he couldn't answer. So a week later, we met again, and they said, okay, what we mean by change is how much in virtual money the rest of the bank is paying us for services. So that's basically salaries and operational costs. So then we realized, okay, before you were Agile, you were able to get 35 million pounds from the rest of the bank for salaries and operational costs. After you go Agile, you will be able to get 70 million pounds from the rest of the bank for salaries and operational costs, which means you want to increase your costs by 35 million. I have a solution for you. Pay me 35 million, I walk away, you are Agile. Unfortunately, they didn't really understand that seriously, so we lost that job. But a lot of talk about scaling Agile is kind of that, just on an even more insane level. There was a really interesting example from the BBC in England where they had this project called My BBC that was supposed to deliver personalization on the video player. And the project spent something like 75 million pounds before being shut down because it didn't deliver any value. And then there was a big question, like, how could somebody spend so much money without having to justify anything, without having to kind of prove how they're, you know, spending money? And the conclusion was fantastic. The conclusion was they were able to spend so much money because it was Agile. Because every month they could declare whatever they've done to be valuable. It was always like, oh, there's good customer feedback, people are giving us new requirements. And this is just insane, it's completely insane. And we're getting into this situation where, you know, there's more and more insane projects like that. So hopefully what I'll try to do today is prevent you from doing something like that. And I think if we're talking about scaling things up, we need to talk about scaling up the outcome, not scaling up the effort. Scaling up the effort is easy. So one of the things that kind of is really, really problematic when we're talking about scaling out the outcome is very few people actually know what kind of outcome they expect or even how to communicate that. The larger the organization, the more difficult it is to communicate that kind of information. I worked with a team where they had a very, very similar situation to this kind of BBC thing. Not 75 million pounds, but less money, but a similar situation where they've been delivering. The team was saying how, oh, you know, we've shipped so many stories, so many story points, who knows what. And the business people were kind of completely disappointed with the outcome. And we tried to kind of figure out what was going on, and everybody was claiming that it was the other people's fault. developers were saying how they got this insanely complex set of requirements they need to finish, so they have to work for about 10 months before they can actually do something that the users can see. But they're reporting on, feedback, story points, and things like that. The business users were complaining how nothing's coming out for months, and how, this whole agile thing was promising that things are going to be faster, but nothing's coming out. And when we started talking to them, actually the technical team was working on completely rewriting the storage infrastructure. They spent 2 months rewriting the storage, and they were moving away from a database to a data grid to kind of massively parallel synchronization, and technically really, really complicated. And you can see why somebody was saying we're going to have 5 months until we have a first version of this. And the requirement for that was a single user story, which is insane. How can a user story be 10 months? But a user story was, we want to move these reports to become real time. They had some reports and they wanted to have real time reports. And kind of one of the things that I've learned is, rather than trying to divide the solution, if you want to release something piece by piece, try to divide the problem. Try to solve a smaller problem. Instead of getting to fully real-time reports, maybe we get faster reports, but not real-time. So then I started kind of talking to the people that actually required this, that were 5 levels away in the organization. And I said, well, can we maybe not spend months and months and months getting this to real-time? How about if we give you something that's slightly faster than what you have now? I said, no, it can't be slightly faster, it needs to be real-time. I said, well, tell me, tell me what are these reports? I'd like to understand this. Maybe we don't need to rewrite all the reports. Maybe we need to rewrite just some reports. Just tell me. I said, well, we have this report for our advertising partners. We send it out to them once a month. Now, everybody else is sending reports out once a month. We were thinking that if we can give our advertising partners real-time reports, they will be able to optimize advertising more frequently, and that's going to make us more money, it's going to make them more money, everybody's going to be happier. I said, okay, but I understand that, so slightly faster is not good, but how about if we give it to you once a day instead of once a month? And he said, yeah, real time. I said, whoa, yeah, real time, once a day. And I realized kind of the complete insanity when you start in one part of the organization and somebody says something that means once a day for them, then it gets kind of transferred to the rest of the organization and becomes a complete rewrite of the storage engine and all the reports. Because that information just gets lost, and this is completely insane. Instead of months and months and months of working, all these people had to do was reconfigure a batch job to run once a day. And that's kind of a big problem with larger organizations, why information gets lost. So Louis Platt, who was the CEO of Hewlett-Packard, famously said that if Hewlett-Packard only knew what Hewlett-Packard already knows, we would be 3 times more profitable and productive. And that's kind of what I think happens in a lot of these organizations. When we talk about scaling up, the more people you involve, the bigger the organization, the more this information just gets lost and distorted. And lots of these kind of funny episodes happen when you realize that you don't need months and months of work, you just need kind of to reconfigure a batch job. So I think kind of lots of these things come from 3 critical illusions we have today around how kind of software works and how we develop software. So the first critical illusion that people have is, I think, that kind of, if somebody says, I want this, that's actually a good requirement. Customers, business people, they kind of tend to express solutions because that's how they think. Somebody thinks a real-time report is the right solution, but maybe kind of that means something completely different. And I think one of the best references about this is a book called What Customers Want by Anthony Ulrich. Anthony was in charge of the 2nd worst product launch in history. Not software, all products ever. So he lost about $500 million directly and $1.2 billion indirectly by doing everything the customers told him they want. Going and talking to people and asking what they do want, collecting requirements, adding all these things up, doing focus groups, doing research, and his big conclusion was that people don't know what they want. They tell you one thing, they want another. They tell you they want something, they need something else. They can't express their needs. So kind of this whole problem with everything is valuable, where kind of we have business stakeholders on one end and developers on the other end, and people give us requirements, assumes that just because somebody said this is what they want, that's actually the true requirement. And it's kind of, as I said, Anthony Ulrich paid $1.7 billion for that mistake. You don't have to do that. We need to figure out better ways of dealing with these things. We need to move away more from kind of requests to needs and things like that. So then we have a second big problem there. It's closely related to this. And this is where the second big illusion is that features are important because somebody important asked for them. Especially in larger organizations, somebody with a title, high enough and salary high enough, if they say, we want cloud, or we want to have a social integration, we want to have a mobile app, that becomes gospel. It becomes something that we accept as taken. So there was a lovely episode from Google a while ago, and one of the best things about this episode is that you can actually read both sides of the story. It's very rare where you can read two sides of the story online. If you Google for 40 Shades of Blue, you will find all the data on this you need. So the head of design at Google, a guy called Doug Bowman, at some point wanted to change the color of the links on the Google homepage. And the developers were trying to kind of understand how they would kind of test this. How do they know that this is good? And he said, well, this color is a lot more noticeable. That's what makes it good. And how I would test this, I would look for the CSS color once it's live. I would check if it's like that. That's my acceptance criteria. So the developers kind of, being relatively good, understood that just because somebody with the title of head of design says something is good, you shouldn't necessarily believe it all the time. And what they've done that night, like the kind of name of the episode suggests, is they've deployed 40 different colors of blue. As a result of that, depending on whose side of story you read, Doug was either fired or quit tomorrow morning. And he wrote a really angry blog post about how you cannot do good design at Google. It's still online, you can still read that. And he was talking about how, nobody trusts your opinion, how you're asked to prove everything, how people don't trust the color theory and, thousands of years of research and whatnot. And a couple of months later, there was a conference in England where somebody was talking about how they do design at Google, and there was, questions in the audience, and somebody raised the hand and said, well, that's all nice, everything you said, but Doug quit and wrote this really angry blog post. He says you can't do good design at Google. And the person on the stage pulls out the data, and according to kind of the data they did from the experiment, if you took Doug's color and you put it on the website in front of 100% of the users, and you let it run for a year, Google would lose something like $250 million. Because his color was not getting people to click more. It was getting people to click less. Now, there's a million reasons why. I mean, maybe this color looks amazingly well when you print it on a $1 million Heidelberg printer that does fantastic colors, but when you look at it on a cheap smartphone, that's not that color, it's a different color. Maybe something else happened, but they were able to prevent this problem because they knew how to look at the outcome, not just the output of what they're going to do. And I think one of the biggest mental shifts that we need to do as a community is separate out outputs from outcomes. Output is I will create this CSS link in this color, whatever. The outcome is we lose $250 million. And then there's a question like, what is good design? I mean, Doug, after Google, went to work for Twitter, where they have an amazing shade of blue, but they're still not making money, so must be really good design. So I think there's lots and lots of data suggesting that even people who have big titles and who are experts are not necessarily always right. Even worse, most of the time they're actually wrong. There's a lovely paper from Microsoft called Online Experimentation at Microsoft. You can download this, Google for Online Experimentation Microsoft. A guy called Ron Kohavi actually looked at lots of things that they've done at Microsoft and figured out whether they've actually moved the numbers they were supposed to move. And he said about 1/3 of ideas improved the measures they were supposed to improve. About 1/3 create no statistically relevant change, and about 1/3 actively damage the numbers they were supposed to improve. In the paper, he also quotes data from Amazon, where apparently Amazon is the best in the industry getting value for features, and he says that at Amazon, the success rate is slightly below 50%. What that means is that if your team is anywhere on the scale between good and great, if we say Microsoft is good, Amazon is great, and your team is somewhere in between, that means that between 2/3 and a half of the things you've done last year were bad ideas. It's a really interesting question to ask, like, why are we keeping these things in our software? Do we even know which half are bad ideas? Think about this. How many features have you removed from your software after they went to production last year? For most people, the answer is 0. Why are you paying 3 times as much for software maintenance? Why are you paying 3 times as long for software testing? Why are you kind of waiting 3 times as long to release stuff? And if you really want to scale things up, rather than hiring 3 times more people, how about figuring out what parts of kind of the things that went live were bad ideas? Because statistically, a lot of them will be bad ideas. Which kind of brings me to the third big illusion that people have with software today, is that we're any good at estimating the value of things up front. People say, oh, this is going to be incredibly valuable, but it turns out it's kind of meh. Or they don't think this is going to be particularly valuable, and it turns out to be amazing. I'm working on a collaboration tool at the moment, and we had this thing where we were trying to increase the number of users at universities for one milestone. We wanted to become number 2 in that market, and we, as part of building this, built about 3 months of features to help people kind of use it better, and we got a really angry email from a university admin who said, you know, with lots of swear words and mentioning my mother and some dogs and who knows what, you know, how stupid our software is. And I replied and said, well, you know, I see you're angry, but can you tell us so maybe we can fix it? He said, you sent me 800 fucking emails. Stop sending me emails. And the interesting thing there is our software has no email sending functionality. It's like, okay, you know, this is probably not us. There are some other tools that are called similarly. Maybe it's one of the other tools, and you just, you know, went to the wrong website. He said, no, it's your stupid software. And he sent me a screenshot with his inbox. His inbox is kind of, you know, full of emails with the same subject. And one of the emails is in focus, and our logo is on the email. I was like, oh, this is really interesting. I didn't expect this stuff. Now, the email wasn't from us, it was from Google Drive, because kind of what usually happens when you integrate with Google Drive, a user says, I would like to save to Google Drive. Google pops up a dialog saying, this user is asking to save to Google Drive. Is that okay, yes or no? You say yes, the dialog goes away, it's done. Not at universities. At universities, or at his particular university, a student says, yes, I would like to save to Google Drive, and an admin gets an email saying, this student would like to save to Google Drive. Do you want to approve that, yes or no? And somebody recommended our app on an online lecture. 700 people wanted to try it, and he got lots of emails. So kind of, at this point, you know, I apologized, and I said, well, that's Google, it's not. I said, no, it's your stupid program that kind of, I cannot do bulk approve. For other programs, I can do bulk approve. And I said, okay, that's interesting. So I started looking at this on, you know, page number 3 of configuring Google Drive integration. There's a button like allow bulk approvals. And I tick that. Now, the trick with that is there is no bulk approve functionality. That doesn't exist. But Google was probably kind of frustrated with people sending them emails like that anyway. So they created a button that pre-installs the application to all the students. So his bulk approve didn't mean approve the app for everybody who requested. It means install this app to all the students in my university. And what that meant was that he could dismiss his 800 emails, but other people that had a similar problem, the first student asks for something, they say bulk approve, it's installed to all the students. Now, our usage rates went up like this. That checkbox did more for us than 3 months of developing features. But if somebody asked me up front, like, how valuable is that? I have no idea. I'd say, you know, better integration features are more important. So we're really, really bad at estimating the value. And that's kind of a big problem. Now, kind of this is where we need to start looking at moving away from linear plans. Linear plans are where you have a sequence of things that needs to happen, typically kind of put in a Jira or something like that. And then people say, oh, we're agile because we're allowing people to prioritize. But usually you end up doing everything. And it's just a question of when something will get done. And there was a lovely book by Tim Harford, who's a British economist, who looked at why linear plans fail. Not in software, but in economy, in civil engineering, in government planning. He said linear plans always tend to fail because you cannot plan for all the dimensions. And he said there's at least 3 dimensions that you cannot possibly plan for, and those 3 dimensions cause experts to make bad decisions. The first dimension he mentioned is locality. Things might work really, really well in one location, but when you translate it to another location, it's a different usage pattern. Things might work really, really well when you have a consumer saving to Google Drive. Translate it to the universities, you don't know what happens there. And there's kind of, we made a bad call. Then you learn and then you make a better call. And unless you're a complete expert in the new locality, you're not going to be able to make a good decision. The second thing he talked about is time. Sometimes, you know, business opportunities open up or close. Delivering this feature now might mean a lot more than delivering that feature 6 months from now, or the other way around. Maybe it's irrelevant now, it becomes relevant later. I remember when we started doing this tool, we had lots of features in the backlog for Google+, because Google was pumping money into Google+ like crazy. But you know, 6 months later, Google+ was a graveyard, so we kind of canceled all those features and decided not to integrate with that. And kind of the time component there is really, really important. Opportunities open up or close as we deliver. If we're really agile, if we can benefit from iterative delivery, we should be able to benefit from these things opening up. And kind of the last dimension he talks about is humans, where humans are completely unpredictable. They tell you one thing, they do another. They kind of do unexpected stuff. They cause weird problems to happen that, you know, you have no idea about because they're not machines. They're not rational. So even the best expert in the world is going to make a bad decision occasionally because of these things. We cannot plan for them. But what we can do is we can make our plans so that we can not just survive, but benefit from something like this when it happens. One of the kind of most interesting things that I've learned from his book is that although this is bad news for everybody, the good news is that all your competitors are suffering from the same thing. So if you can organize your process so that you are benefiting from when something unexpected happens, and they are not, you can be significantly better than them. So Harford talks about good plans from a perspective of this Russian civil engineer who invented Lean Startup about 150 years ago. And he calls it Palczynski principles. The story of this guy, Piotr Palczynski, is really, really interesting, but it's a kind of separate thing. So he says, in order to benefit from kind of unexpected opportunities, you need to have 3 components of a good plan. The first one is variation. Because we don't really know what's going to work out or what's not going to work out, our plans shouldn't be just the minimum that is expected to be delivered. Our plans need to be options for lots of things we might do or might not do. And then we can kind of figure out what goes in, what doesn't go in. The second thing he talks about is kind of how all these things need to be survivable, so that if they turn out to be a bad idea, we shouldn't kind of have to cancel the whole project. And those 2 components, I think almost everybody can do. You can get people drunk on vodka and they will come up with 50 different ideas how to deliver something. No problem at all. Usually people have too much work, not too little work. In terms of getting survivable, we are a lot better today as an industry. We know how to split things, but what we are missing is the third component. The third component that he talks about is selection. Now, not selection in terms of what gets into the software. Selection in terms of what was a good idea. What turned out to be a good idea. From an evolutionary perspective, what should we keep? And that's something that most teams do not have in their process. And that's kind of a big problem, because if we know that between 1/2 and 2/3 of the things are bad ideas, not having a selection criteria what to keep and what to delete is actually what's causing us to need to create these kind of big scaling systems and things like that. So what Hartford is talking about is how these things are not good plans, they're not good roadmaps, because pretty much all of them will be done, so there's no variation. Okay, they are survivable, but there's no selection criteria. What he's talking about is that these are good roadmaps. The trick is in the name, it's a map of roads. With a map like this, you never, ever, ever want to go through all the roads. But that doesn't mean that those things are not useful to have on the map, because they allow us to handle unexpected things. If I try to get from here to here and this bridge is blocked, okay, there's another bridge there. I'm trying to get to this place, I'm not trying to cross a particular bridge. Or, you know, and things like this are good plans. Now, we don't create plans like this in software, because plans like this tend to be really difficult to use for replanning. If you have lots of stuff, imagine if you had 10 times more stuff in your backlog than you have now, or 3 times more, it's just making planning more difficult. And without a good selection criteria, that becomes even more problematic. Now, what's changed how we use these maps about 10 or 15 years ago is we got an automatic selection criteria in the form of this. We started having devices like this that make replanning cheap, which meant that I don't have to plot the whole journey when I start. I can just start going, and if a road is blocked, it's okay, it's going to tell me where to go. I can take a wrong turn. It's not a problem at all. I can miss a turn. I can make small mistakes. This will help me correct it cheaply, because it has turn-by-turn navigation. That's the component that was added. Kind of maps like this, for hundreds of years, we had variation, we had survivability. But what we got with this was turn-by-turn navigation, an automated selection criteria. And that's something we have to do for our software plans, to create a GPS for this. And the big question for you is, how do you create a GPS for your product? How do we create operational awareness, where we are and how we deliver and what we need to do? Now, there's a couple of interesting theories in place there. One absolutely lovely book on project execution, I strongly recommend everybody reads, is called 4 Disciplines of Execution. And they're talking about how most organizations, when they have metrics, they only have they either have metrics that are kind of measuring effort, like story points, like, you know, burn-up charts, burn-down charts. Those are measuring how many people you have working on the project and how long you've worked on the project, how much money you've burned delivering this. They're not measuring what we got as an outcome, or they're measuring outcome from a kind of very, very large-scale perspective, like revenue or market share or brand awareness, things that are really difficult to measure, things that you can only measure when everything is done. And they talk about how these things, none of these things are good measurements for replanning and for understanding where you are. So they have this idea where you need to come up with indicators that you can measure on a shorter time scale that tell you whether you're going in the right direction or not. It's this. And one of the conclusions in the book is that behavior changes are a fantastically good way of creating these leading indicators, because we can measure behavior changes on a shorter time scale. I can deliver a piece of software, I can see whether people are clicking more on that link. I don't know if that's going to bring more revenue or not, I can assume, but I can measure if they're clicking more on that link. I can reconfigure a batch job and I can see if people are planning their advertising more frequently. That's a change in people's behavior. And changes in behavior are amazing because we can observe them on a shorter time scale. We can deliver them partially. If we need to change the behavior of the traders in the bank, we don't have to change everybody's behavior. We can change the behavior of a subgroup of traders first, like equity traders or something like that. And we can also scale the whole behavior change. We can say, well, if we need to get people to plan 30 times faster, maybe let's get them to plan 20 times faster. That's already valuable. So instead of thinking about delivering real time, let's deliver once a day. But all those options open up when we start talking about solving smaller problems and figuring out whether we actually solve the problem. So if you remember one thing from this, remember that behavior changes are a really, really good way of estimating and measuring value for software stuff. So this is where we can start creating hierarchical backlogs. We can start creating backlogs where we have some business goals like revenue, market share, profit on the top, and we'll measure those things a year later. That's fine. But then we can create a connection between that and epics and stories through behavior changes. We can measure those things on a shorter time scale. And then we can create a hierarchy of these things that can help us figure out, are we going in the right direction? Imagine that, you know, I have 20 epics that are supposed to help with one impact. That's kind of planning advertising faster. I can deliver the first 3 epics and I can measure, are people planning advertising faster? Are they planning advertising faster enough? The nice thing about the change is you can ask how much. Like, how much faster is faster? Does it need to be 10%, 500%, 50%? So imagine that, you know, we have 20 epics that are supposed to get us there 50% faster. The first 3 get us 50% faster. We are done. The other 17 epics just became not now. They've become deprioritized. Or we have 20 epics that are supposed to get us there 20% faster. The first 3 don't move the number in the right direction at all. Maybe there's something unexpected we're not seeing there. Maybe there's a local human or time-based dimension that we are not seeing. We need to stop and replan. So putting behavior changes in the middle between goals and software deliverables allows us to create a GPS for our software. And that's kind of where impact mapping comes in. Impact mapping is a visualization technique that kind of connects all these dots. It's a way to create roadmaps. It's a way to create plans where we connect business goals through kind of whose behavior are we changing, how are they supposed to change their behavior, and then what are the deliverables to help us with their behavior change. And then we can create a roadmap that has variation, that has all these options to get people to come back more frequently. And then we can start delivering and measure, are people coming back more frequently enough? We can create operational awareness. We can figure out where we're going. And impact maps are an amazingly good way of kind of creating this visual landscape for what we want to deliver. So over the last, I don't know, 8 or 9 years, lots of organizations have tried this stuff out. And I'm currently writing a new book. We're interviewing people that have used this stuff and figuring out how they're using it and what they're doing. And I've heard some completely amazing stories where we kind of, one of the tax offices was doing this system to detect fraud better. And they were going to design this artificial intelligence, machine learning, data, big data, all the buzzwords in, to detect fraud better. And by kind of positioning it as an impact map and starting to deliver very quickly, they've realized that actually humans are much better at detecting fraud than machines are, but they have too much work. So instead of getting the machine to detect fraud, what they got the machine to do is kind of detect what's definitely not fraud, so that humans can spend more time looking at what potentially is fraud. And they delivered, I don't know, 10% of the scope. Their estimate later on was that they detected 3 times more fraud than they expected to detect, kind of 3 times better than the business case. I talked to an organization that was delivering software for rebuilding, planning rebuilding works. There was an earthquake in a city and kind of the city was half demolished. They had all these building crews kind of working at the same time, and they were trying to kind of create some software that's going to plan the work. Again, artificial intelligence, you know, big data, who knows what. And After doing this thing as an impact map and starting to deliver and measuring what they're doing, actually what they ended up doing is a smarter calendar. And kind of their estimate was that they saved 10 times more money than what they originally thought they're going to save by actually doing this stuff. So there's lots and lots of really wonderful stories about this, but one thing I've definitely learned is that although impact maps are simple, I can explain them in 5 minutes, they're not easy. There's a big distinction between simple and easy that people don't understand often. Simple means I can explain it in 5 minutes, but easy, kind of, can we implement actually this? And it turns out this is quite difficult to implement. And it's quite difficult to implement partially because I oversimplified the whole thing when I wrote the book, so it's my mistake. And when I wrote the book, I was approaching this mostly from my experience and my perspectives, which is working with kind of teams that can deliver quickly, working with teams that usually work towards a business goal. We can iterate, we can test. And what I've learned interviewing these people is there's 4 different contexts in which impact maps tend to be useful. And the way how we apply them completely differs. And kind of, I've heard people using impact maps for focusing delivery, like, oh, we have this big project, we have 2 years of user stories to do, let's figure out what to do first. Let's really achieve a business goal and then figure out, how long does that take. I've also heard people completely reframing the problem, like this tax office that after designing this wonderful artificial intelligence to detect fraud, actually reframed it completely. And he said, okay, we don't want to detect fraud, we want to detect what's not fraud. And let people deal with the fraud. And there's a third context where people are using this to set the vision for what they want to achieve, where lots of different stakeholders have lots of different needs, requirements, budgets, and they're all in disagreement what's important, what's not important. And having something like this to get all the stakeholders to actually kind of visualize this stuff and agree on one goal becomes incredibly powerful. And lastly, I've actually heard people redesigning their business operations using impact maps. That's something that I've not really anticipated. Several consultancies that started using impact maps to deliver software actually realized, well, we want to create a new department in the organization, or we want to kind of rebuild this department differently. And they were using impact maps to kind of figure out what they need to change in their organization, process-wise, not kind of did nothing to do with software. So kind of these 4 things really come up with completely different constraints. So first, focusing delivery is where kind of we know what the objectives are, but there's kind of too many objectives. People want to reduce operational cost, they want to open up a new market, they want to do this, they want to do that. And then kind of the big question is, well, do we work on everything at the same time or not? And kind of usually when you get technical people to then split delivery, we end up in something that Forrester Research described in their wonderful paper. So Forrester did this research about 3 years ago, and they interviewed about 10,000 organizations around how they actually implement Agile. And they concluded that by far, the most popular Agile process out there is something they called water, scrum, fall. That's what most organizations do. Kind of all the big decisions are made up front, and then, you children can go and play Scrum as much as you want, nobody cares. And then when it all comes together, we take it live. Now, the problem with that is that whatever business goals you want to achieve, or the organization wants to achieve, you only start achieving them at the end. Because the software really only goes live at the end, because nobody cares in between. And that's kind of the result of people splitting this stuff into user stories that don't really drive any big business value. But when we have lots of objectives, we can start talking about, okay, hey, you have all these 20 objectives, you can achieve them by the end, or you can choose one of them to achieve next month. Which one? And then we can really start kind of figuring out how to group the deliverables to start focusing on some key business objectives. So kind of one thing that I've learned, if you want to use impact maps for focusing delivery, it's really, really important to agree on a goal up front. Rather than jumping into an impact mapping session, I like to organize like a half day or even a full day session with key stakeholders to just get them to fight about the goals. Because very often they don't even agree on what the goals are or how many goals. And in a focusing delivery situation, jumping into an impact mapping session without a clear goal is a disaster, because people will just end up being frustrated at the end. The next thing that's really, really important is that the team that delivers and the stakeholders need to be in the room to create the map together. Because the delivery team will, or at least the senior people from the delivery team will know, hey, this is potentially a week of work, this is 7-man millennia of work. So maybe let's prioritize this. Or when they actually understand what the problem is, when they understand that the behavior change we're trying to achieve is people planning advertising faster, they can propose much better solutions than redesigning the whole kind of storage system. So the third thing is, in a situation like this, people often get lost by spending too much time on low-level deliverables. So I think if you want to focus delivery, just focus on high-level deliverables. Focus on epics or even kind of bigger chunks of work, and put that in the context of behavior changes. Then select one of behavior change and kind of start delivering that. Don't waste time doing low-level deliverables. But the critically important piece of this is, if you want to focus delivery, then all the impacts you have on the map need to have very, very strong metrics. One of the key indicators of kind of who's done well versus who's not done well in this case is whether people had metrics around impacts. If we're talking about planning advertising faster, how much faster? And get people to actually agree on that. So the last thing is, as we kind of start delivering, it's really, really important to review these metrics every week. Every retrospective, every delivery kind of review how these metrics are moving, and then allow stakeholders to say, well, we want to keep investing in this piece, or we don't want to keep investing in this piece. We are done. That's what really helps kind of focus and narrow down the delivery. Opposed to that, if we're talking about reframing a problem, so reframing a problem where, compared to the previous case, there's too many objectives. Here, the objectives are really unclear or they're not shared. Lots of people kind of think they agree, but they don't agree. Instead of getting everybody to work together, it turns out that actually a lot better thing to do is get a single person to go around and talk to different groups individually and get their opinion first, and then structure that as a document, get everybody's kind of goals together, and figure out what they think this should be done. Usually that involves somebody analyzing some kind of regulatory documents or analyzing a legacy system, figuring out where are we, where do we need to go, and that's not something that can happen with 10 people in a room. I've tried this, I've failed horribly, and now I know why I failed, because I was trying to approach it from a kind of focusing delivery perspective, and it was really a reframing problem context. So in this case, again, high-level deliverables only are important, but you don't have to have metrics on those deliverables. If you're reframing a problem, you don't actually need to have like 50% faster or 10% faster. It's okay to talk about faster. That wasn't such a big difference. On the other hand, kind of having really, really detailed goal metrics. What do we actually want to achieve? Because that helps all these different stakeholders then actually say, well, yes, I agree, that's the goal, or that's the objective, is important. And people tend to measure their deliverables against this kind of goal objective at the end. One example of that is, there's a government agency in the US, we've not really gotten the permission to publish anybody's names yet. We'll publish all the names in the book, we're working through that. There's a government agency where they were going to kind of replace 2 different legacy systems with a new system, and of course it's going to be a like-for-like replacement, all the features and 5 years of work and things like that. They actually achieved what they call full operational readiness. They went live 2 years ahead of schedule by doing this. And they did that because they figured out that one of the key metrics they want to measure is how many cases can a single human process during a day. And they had that number plastered everywhere, in all the development groups, in all the reports, in all the meetings. Everybody was reporting, okay, our new number is this. And that's how they were able to kind of drive this thing and get to the destination 2 years before schedule. So the third context is where people want to set a vision for something. So usually this is where you get lots and lots of deliverables. You don't really have any objectives, where often this is a third-party development scenario where you have a client and a supplier company where the client comes up with a Word document with 500 requirements. And lots of people use the impact maps in this case to figure out and help the clients create a vision. What do you actually want to achieve with this? How do we contribute with our software development here? And this is done even before the contract is signed. So in this case, what's really, really important is a draft of a goal, not a detailed goal. Kind of for focusing delivery, you want a detailed goal, you want an agreement, a draft of a goal like, okay, this is really about increasing market share. Or this is really about protecting revenue. Or this is kind of, we don't really have all the details, but we kind of agree that this is what we want to achieve on a high level, or what the client wants to achieve. And then kind of the really interesting thing is, kind of the key stakeholders need to create a map together. When I've heard the agencies working with clients, it's kind of 2 or 3 client representatives and 2 or 3 representatives from the delivery company, usually kind of a senior technical person and a senior sales guy, and kind of a relatively small group building this map together. But the critical lesson here is don't let them talk about deliverables at all. Like, use deliverables to inspire them to talk about impacts, but don't put deliverables on the map. Unlike the previous 2 contexts where discussing high-level deliverables is good, discussing deliverables here is a no-go at all. People just get completely lost, they get stuck in details, they get bored, and usually kind of stay on the level of impacts and get the delivery team to come up with deliverables later. Say, okay, you know, once we've agreed on the impacts, we'll tell you what we think is a good way to achieve this stuff. And kind of, usually kind of the impacts then get turned into something completely different, not a map. We've heard this being turned into a vision document, an RFP, a contract, and a bunch of other things, but kind of the map disappears from then on. And kind of the last context that I've heard people talk about impact maps is changing a business. As I mentioned, a couple of consulting agencies have started redesigning their entire business, their internal business process using this. As opposed to kind of everything else I've mentioned, when this is done, usually kind of it's the group that actually delivers on their own, they create an impact map. The stakeholders, senior business management or kind of people outside don't really participate there, because most of the time it's kind of people who are delivering thinking about how they want to change their part of the business. Those are people involved. And usually kind of they give this to stakeholders to review later. External stakeholders or kind of managers of other departments. And those maps actually end up with very, very detailed action items. Unlike high-level deliverables, this has like 20 minutes of work items or 1 day of work items go onto the map. And that map is then used like a roadmap for people to tick off individual actions. And kind of is more or less used like a delivery plan. So that's kind of 4 different contexts how impact maps are used. And I think the most important thing to remember, again, forget about impact maps and everything, is if you need a good model of value for what you're delivering, look for behavior changes. Look for kind of how much and look for whom, and then you can kind of scale that in lots of different directions. So as a couple of bonus ideas we collected through the interviews, one thing that turns out to be universally good is whenever you need to do an impact map with people who've not done impact mapping before, try to come up with an example map in your domain. It doesn't have to be for this particular project, but an example map in your domain. Lots of people found that really, really useful. Showing example maps that I have on the website and things like that gets people confused. So the second kind of interesting tip that I've heard a couple of times is, especially kind of when you don't think that, when you don't know if people share the same goal, several people use this trick where they got people to write down what they think the goal is individually, and then put it all on the wall and compare. And that turns out a really kind of fascinating visualization exercise, especially in the focusing delivery part in the workshop before the impact mapping, where you want to get people to agree on a goal, or if you want to create a draft of a goal for setting the vision, this tends to be a good exercise. The third really interesting tip, I've heard several people getting stuck on actors because they think about, well, whose behavior can we change, who can impact this, and then almost everybody's there. One of the funniest things that somebody said is they had like United Nations. You can petition United Nations to kind of, you know, ask for something from the government, which is insane. That's, of course you can do that, but does it make any sense? It's not necessarily in your zone of control. So I think a much better approach is to work on the impacts and let the actors emerge. So don't, when you have stakeholders in the room and they're talking about, oh, we want to all these 5 different groups and 10 groups and more groups of people who we can influence, stop the discussion, get them to think about behavior changes. So don't do an impact map from the left to the right, start in the middle. And the next kind of tip is lots of these people said, well, you know, we have all these things like whose behavior we want to change, how are we changing their behavior and things like that, but there's lots of other constraints we want to capture there, like we cannot lose revenue, or this thing has to be in line with our political values or something like that. And lots of people found it really, really useful to just kind of put that somewhere on the side on the map. If you try to structure it into the map, it doesn't make sense. They started breaking the hierarchy and then it becomes inconsistent. That's useful information to keep, but put it somewhere on the side. And kind of the last tip I have for you, and I've stolen this from the 4 Disciplines of Execution. Again, lovely book, read it, is get a team to create their own scoreboard. The metaphor they use is that if you are not keeping score, you're just practicing, you're not actually playing the game. You need to keep score in order to be able to play the game. And lots of people create these management scoreboards, KPIs and things like that to punish teams when they're not doing well. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about get the team to create their own scoreboard. Get the team to kind of understand what outcomes they need to deliver. And then visualize and manage this just for them. Not to show it to anybody else, but so that they can track how well they are doing and what they're achieving. So that's pretty much it. I'd like to kind of use this opportunity to ask anybody who has experience with impact mapping and think you have an interesting story to tell. We're interviewing people now for the book. I'd like to kind of talk to you about your experiences. So if you'd like to know when the book comes out, it's probably going to be April or May next year. This is the link. You can kind of just, you know, tick a box there and I'll let you know. And also, if you have a nice story to tell, please get in touch there, because then we'll get in touch with you to kind of interview you for the book. Thank you very, very much. I think we're coming close to kind of 15 past, so probably take questions in the last break or something like. Is it possible to define success criteria? I think kind of the best thing I can suggest about this is to read a book about how Hewlett-Packard did this on their printers. Because doing printers in an agile way doesn't sound logical at all. And the book has this horrible title, something like Large Scale Agile something, Hewlett-Packard Firmware. But the lovely thing they've done is they looked at, well, at the moment, we are doing 90% of our time spending doing feature maintenance, and about 10% of our time, or I think 5%, building new features. I said, if we become agile, whatever that means, we will be spending 70% of our time developing new features, and we'll be spending 30% of our time doing maintenance. And then they use that as a metric to guide everything else. I think it's absolutely impossible. How do you deal with the hippo problem? I think you don't deal with the hippo problem, you engage the hippo to kind of explain their objectives. When you get the objectives out, Hippo's bonuses usually depend on meeting objectives, not delivering software. If you can figure out what the objectives are and align with those objectives, it becomes really, really easy to prioritize and plan. How do you convince management about the value of removing bad features? Why would you even have to convince anybody about the value of removing bad things? I don't understand this. Like, less maintenance, less money lost. I mean, Google did this and they said we're going to lose $250 million. There was no convincing required to remove that. So figure out what the negative outcome is and kind of display that. I think we should stop here because we're coming close to 15. So I'm happy to take more questions during the next break.
we can submit the questions for you to answer later.
Yeah, yeah. Good. Thank you very much.